LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty, and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Frank Landis, who joins us to give his first ever interview about his book Hot Earth Dreams: What If Severe Climate Change Happens and Humans Survive? What would the Earth look like if severe climate change did happen and humanity survived? It's not an easy question to contemplate, let alone answer. If severe climate change happens, the Earth will continue to warm for centuries after we've exhausted our fossil fuels. Civilization will shatter, the great artworks and monuments vanishing as cities fall into rubble and coasts disappear beneath rising seas. There will be mass extinctions, coral reefs and ice sheets will vanish, and the survivors will migrate to new homes and habitats for generations as the climate continually changes. Only after hundreds of thousands of years will the climate return to what we currently consider normal. As things stand, this is our most likely future. Terrifying as it sounds at first, it's a future that's fascinating to explore. It's crazy, then horrible, then tough, and then increasingly strange. How much of our language and culture can survive? Hundreds of thousands of years from now, will future humans still look the same as us? Weaving together the latest scientific research on climate change, mass extinction, collapse, and evolution, Hot Earth Dreams speculates about a deep future that lies beyond the simplistic scenarios favoured today, presenting a profound challenge to those who insist that humanity's future must be either imminent and total extinction, or some utopian fantasy fueled by ever-advancing transhumanist technology. Hello and welcome, Frank, and thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Well, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Frank, today we're going to be talking about your book, Hot Earth Dreams. Before we dive into that, just tell listeners a little bit about your background and the genesis of the book.
Okay, well, my background is I'm basically a biology nerd, which means that originally I was hoping to go into academia, so I spent quite a long time in grad school, and I picked up a PhD in botany, and we can dive into the nuts and bolts of how the degrees work, but I'm basically an ecologist by training, and I work with plants, and at that point I was kind of burned out on academia, and I didn't get a job there, so I bounced around and ended up now I'm basically a house husband, and I've got a wife who's got a very good job, so I can write and consult and do other, and generally be a bit of a gadfly. Now, the book, Hot Earth Dreams, is basically the answer to a question that I started bumping into about 3 years ago. It has to do with climate change. I do a lot of volunteering as an environmentalist. I work on conservation issues, and one of the problems with climate change, well, there's a lot of problems, but the thing is, climate change has kind of sucked all the oxygen out of the room when it comes to conservation. People don't really care about saving endangered species or even not so endangered species right now because they were sitting there, people are sitting around with this, well, we're all going to die in a few years anyway because the climate's changing, or some other myth that they may have running around their heads. And so all the money goes to trying to do something about that. And anyways, I started looking at climate change. And then I started looking at what seemed to be the most obvious model to me, which is probably we're going to experience severe climate change unless we really get our act together and totally transform our global civilization starting, well, it should have been about 30 years ago, but hopefully starting now. So if that doesn't happen, we're going to experience severe climate change. But on the other hand, probably humans aren't going to go extinct. I mean, everybody likes to think, oh yeah, we're all going to die. But when you ask people to stop and think, they say, well, do you really think humans are going to go extinct? They go, no. So what does that future look like? And that was the question that underlies the book, which is what if severe climate change happens and humans don't go extinct? And again, this wheels back to my background. I'm an ecologist, so I asked myself that question, what's that world going to look like? And I had absolutely no way to answer. It was just like this, I bounced off a wall. It was blank. And so I started asking my friends, what do you think that world's going to look like if we have severe climate change and humans survive? Nobody had an answer. I think the best someone came up with was, I think it'll look like Waterworld. And I shouldn't mock him because he's actually a really good ecologist. But that kind of got me thinking, because if that's what we think is our most likely future and it's literally unspeakable, I mean, it stops people from speaking about it, then maybe we need to start exploring it. And I decided that was something to start working on. So, long explanation, but hopefully it helps understand where it came from. And as you said, as well, a lot of people have noticed it's a fairly complex topic, but I think it's understandable. It takes someone to spend a few years working through it and showing how it all works together.
Well, interestingly, I did some conservation volunteering a few years ago, and my experience in general, just talking with the managers and the other volunteers, is that generally people don't want to talk about climate change other than like platitudes, really. And it's just interesting. It's one of these very eco-conscious people, shall I say, in the group I was with, and they kind of like fingers in the ears. Nah, can't hear you. When I got on some of the subjects that are in your book. Yeah,
I've certainly had that experience, and I think we've had bigger experiences. And on a slightly larger scale, a lot of the actions that the conservation community takes, they're based on two assumptions. One is that the world is unchanging, except for the way that humans mess it up. And the other thing is that if you can separate humans from nature, nature will heal itself. But we're getting into this world where the climate's changing, humans are responsible for it, and human action is going to be essential no matter what happens. That's a totally different frame of reference for conservationists. So I can totally understand everybody sticking their fingers in their ears, but the trouble is if you're working from assumptions that no longer hold, how are your actions going to help?
Your book is interesting. Humans Survive is in the title, and this takes it away from the more, dare I say it, doomy end of the climate change blogosphere and other publications that are out there. And actually, even though your book is full of some pretty grim predictions, ultimately, as you just mentioned, it doesn't mean the extinction of the human race. Now, are you familiar with the work of Guy McPherson?
Not right offhand, I'm sorry to say.
Okay, well, he's well known in the climate change community, shall I put it that way, though it doesn't always show much sense of community, but he is definitely human extinction, 100% guaranteed. I've read a lot. In fact, he's been a guest on here in the past and bears out my point that I made to you before we went on air, that I don't edit guests because I don't actually agree with Guy McPherson, but he's very much either or. You can't, either it's like it's sail off into the sunset and everything will be fine, our techno-utopian future, or as Guy would have it, we're all going to die really soon.
And I'm saying, like Greer, the archdruid, I'm saying that there's this massive span of other possibilities that are between those two extremes. And yeah, that was one of the things I've had to deal with a lot, is the dualistic thinking. I think the characterization is Mad Max or Star Trek, I think is sort of a gentler characterization, same thing. But I think John Michael Greer says that's sort of like the Book of Revelations. It's either heaven or hell. There's nothing else.
Yeah, quite. And I have to thank John Michael Greer, who I've had on the show a whole bunch of times, because he's the one that actually hooked us up. So that's when I was trying to find out how to get hold of you. So I've got him to thank. But yeah, his work, has in common with yours this idea that it's not a very popular one, that actually, we're going to have a future. It's just not going to look like what we thought. Whereas for some people, as I say, the doom scenario is appealing because, we're all going to die, who cares? And the other one, as I mentioned, is technology-fueled fantasy, where there's no limit to human ingenuity when it comes to solving our problems, ecological or otherwise.
Yeah, I'll give credit to John Michael Greer, actually, because he was the one that introduced me to that idea. Reading his, I think it was The Long Descent. I looked at that one. It was sort of a head slap, well, duh, when I read what he was saying about the dichotomous outcomes, and I think he's totally right. We're in America, certainly, and I don't know about in Britain, but we're very much programmed to have these dualistic, be very dualistic, heaven, hell, yes, no, in, out kind of stuff. You certainly see that a lot in our political rhetoric. It's a very simple way to think and a very easy way to think. It's just the problem is reality tends to come in not just rainbow of colors other than black and white. It tends to come with textures and all sorts of other things. So dualistic thinking can be very limiting, I think is a polite way to say it.
Yeah, I mean, it's rampant, as you say, on the political scene, and it only seems to be getting worse. I'm not sure what the layout of Congress or the Senate is, but you look at the British Parliament and you've got opposing parties sitting opposite each other, screaming insults like a bunch of kids. It's absolutely pathetic. And you get it in the media as well. There always has to be some kind of black or white explanation for everything, and anything in between. Subtlety is kind of just like, ooh, can't even spell that. One thing I like about your book is, I don't know if you'd agree with me here, but it's relatively dispassionate in the sense that you're not avoiding questions or you're not actually trying to prepare people for anything. It's quite scientific in a way, even when you're not talking about science, because it's just, here's what I've discovered, here's what I think will happen, and it's over such a gargantuan time scale that really for me it's a new way to think about the climate future.
There's actually at least two reasons I did that. Notice I tend to give complicated answers, but part of it is, yes, it's a very complicated time scale. Climate change happens over hundreds of years. Sea level rise happens over probably at least 1,000 years. It'll take hundreds to thousands to possibly hundreds of thousands of years for the environment to come back to what we consider normal right now. People are very, very bad at thinking on that scale, on that time scale. That's one big point. Is just you have to start dealing with it intellectually. I don't know how you feel, how you can possibly feel about 100,000 years when your lifespan's in decades. I mean, it's not your time scale. But the other issue is the idea that civilization collapses and human population goes from billions to hundreds of millions, if we're lucky, is really horrifying, and it's really hard to deal with emotionally. The book has kind of got some corny humor and a lot of sarcasm, and it's very intellectual. And that's because that was the way I could deal with it, and I think that's the way a lot of readers can deal with it. If I tried to talk about what an apocalypse really would look like and how it would feel to all the families watching, they realize they don't have any kids or they watch their grandkids die or whatever. As I said, we can wallow in the horror, but that doesn't really necessarily help, especially if you're looking at trying to tell people that it's survivable.
Yeah, I've had I'm sure you'll probably be listening to this, but I had a communication from a gentleman living in mainland Europe, and he's very concerned about what's going on in the world vis-a-vis what we're discussing here. And I know that he's very conflicted because he's a father. You're thinking about, all right, the timescales that you're talking about are huge, but we're seeing changes right now in the world. And I think even if you take a kid who's born today, even by the time that child reaches adulthood, the world could look quite different, like 18 years from now. So, and established patterns are breaking right now. There's no question about it. There's a lot of talk, and I think, as you said, people have a lifespan of decades and they really struggle with long time scales, but I think people struggle even with 100 years plus. I've had a couple of guests on who've been talking about this, things that are actually happening now that are sort of presage, what we can see more of in future. I mean, if somebody says there's no effect, climate change is somewhere off in the distance, look at all the mass migration we're seeing. I'm not now talking about the wars in the Middle East, but there's mass migration happening all over the place. And this is a reality, and it's one thing we're going to see more of. And in fact, the Arab Spring, one thing that a lot of people don't mention about that, they make it like a political, social uprising. It's climate. It's climate. Egypt and many other countries in the Middle East, they're running out of water. They can't feed their own citizens, and this is to do with climate change. Whatever else conflict is going on in the background.
Yeah, I totally agree on that, and I think, and even more with the Arab Spring, and again, this is as I understand it, because I'm just reading the internet. A lot of it was sparked by a failure of the wheat harvest in Russia, because they're importing their bread. Yeah, I totally agree. We're looking at an age of migrations probably bigger than what happened at the end of the Roman Empire and the various times when the nomads were coming off the steppe and invading China. And it's going to be very hard for us. And I think part of the problem is we live in a political system with the United Nations as sort of the overarching idea where we've got a nation state where people are supposed to stay within boundaries and goods are supposed to be delivered to those countries. But if people can't survive in their country, then they're going to do what people have always done for the last 100,000 years to deal with the problems, is they're going to migrate. And every living thing, just about, including plants, migrates in the face of climate change. And climate's changed in the past, but unfortunately we've got a very static system. That's one of the hard things that's going to be really hard to deal with is, how do we deal with people moving? How do we deal with everything moving?
Yeah, I mean, I was sitting here in the UK listening to all the discussion and debate around the so-called migrant crisis that they're now talking about. Never mind the population of any given country, in this case Britain, increasing. There's a sort of elephant in the room situation. Like, I completely understand why migrants are doing what they're doing, and I'm not making any value judgment here whatsoever, but just from an administrator's point of view or a politician's point of view, at what point is the way you're handling this in terms of numbers of people coming in not going to wash with the public anymore? They're talking about 5,000 migrants being allowed into Britain every year, which sounds absurdly low. This is migrants from Syria and what have you. 50,000? Is that too many? 150,000? 5 million? If you see what I mean. At some point, this trend is not going to go away. And I wonder and I worry about what the response will be down the line.
I worry too. You can't stop worrying. Well, you can stop worrying by just ignoring it, but it's also a good time to start reading history as much as anything else. History is always an imperfect analogy, but people have gone through this before. The Romans went through it, the Chinese went through it, India's gone through it, the Ottomans went through it. It's happened before. And if you start looking in the literature, you can find at least some reports of what it was like. And I don't think there's any easy solutions, because I think if you know anything about history, they talk about barbarian invasions, which is totally inappropriate with Syria, because Syria's been civilized longer than Britain has existed as a civilized country by thousands of years. But we're starting to think of them as the barbarians on the shore that are coming in.
You have parts of the Middle East which are now virtually uninhabitable. I was reading recently on the BBC that in Baghdad, capital of Iraq, there was a new highest ever, since recordings began, new highest ever temperature. And it was something insane, like the high 40s degrees C, halfway to boiling point in that city. These countries that are being taken apart by the so-called allies, Iraq being the first example, Libya another one. I don't know about you, but in my lifetime, I don't expect to see a recovery. I mean, Iraq was one of the most civilized, if I can put it that way, countries in the Middle East under Saddam Hussein. Women went to university. It was the most Western looking of those countries, if you see what I mean. And I just don't see that coming back.
This gets to one of the things I talk about in the book of the collapse of global civilization. Now, I suppose I should mention in the I have a basic model that I use throughout the book, and as a conceptual model, which they call the mosaic model. And this will steer back to Iraq in about a minute. But the idea is the way you make a mosaic. I'm sure everybody knows, mosaic is where you break up pieces of various minerals and glasses and stones and things and make a picture out of them by putting the pieces around. Another author, and I'm very good at stealing ideas, but Terry Tempest Williams talked about mosaics as a metaphor for conservation in life, where what happens is you take the old thing, you shatter it, and then you pick up the pieces and make something new out of it. And usually one of the essential parts of that is you grieve about, is the grief as the old system breaks. Now, when you look at global civilization, and we do really have a global civilization now, things break all the time. We have wars, we have crises, we have earthquakes wiping out cities, we have diseases. Well, we haven't had a pandemic for a while. But the essential part of civilization is things get rebuilt from the pieces. Now, what happens when you're talking about a collapse is things break and nothing gets rebuilt from the pieces. If we're talking about collapse, that's how collapse starts. If you really want a disquieting thought, it's possible that we're already seeing the collapse of civilization, a global civilization, at least, starting in the Middle East. And what will happen, as you say, is, where it starts is places like Iraq and Syria. If after the war goes away, there's nobody left, there's no rebuilding, it's just people abandoning the cities and trying to go elsewhere. We won't know if that's even where collapse started, probably for another 10 years. That's kind of a eerie thought, but it's quite possible.
Well, I mean, as far as you say, when the war goes away, maybe slightly off topic, but there seems to be no end game in sight for the, as the aforementioned allies. They went into Iraq and busted that. They did the same in Libya. They're doing the same in Syria now. They've done it all over the place, and there really doesn't seem to be a plan. And that's, I was going to say it's strange, but maybe it isn't. But like literally and of course Afghanistan is a good example of that. When the Americans and the British have been in and out of there. When they first went into Afghanistan, I remember thinking the Soviets were in here for a decade. This was in the early days of the Afghan invasion. They were in here for a decade. They were armed to the teeth. And the Taliban sent them home with their tails between their legs, So, again, it's like, the only way I could see out of this is what Ron Paul, the US presidential candidate from the last run, was saying. Just leave. Just come home. You can only make this worse.
You do know when the British started their involvement with Afghanistan, right? It was, 1838 or something? Oh,
yeah. People have been interfering in that pile of rocks for a long time.
Yeah, and I wouldn't call it. Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is, I don't think of Afghanistan as necessarily a pile of rocks. I mean, for me as a botanist, that's where they domesticated carrots. So it's there, and it was back in the Bronze Age. That was one of the places where they were exporting copper and tin to the Middle East. So it's kind of this. We get all these different lenses through which we look. It's sort of. For the last 200 years or so, we've looked at it as sort of, it's the pile of rocks on the edge of the empire. And, whether it's the Russian Empire, the British Empire, the Persian Empire, it's kind of this mess in the middle, where the mountains are really high and it's really hard to invade. Yeah, the thing is, the only reason I was thinking about this is, back in the early 90s, after America had armed the Taliban and some of it, or whatever, the Mujahideen, sorry, not the Taliban. My mistake there. We didn't follow through at the end and help them out in rebuilding the country. We just kind of said, oh, those guys, we got another crisis to deal with, and then left them. And that's when the Taliban started. So I'm not sure Ron Paul's got the right answer either, but I don't know how, at this point, it's such a huge long supply line for the U.S. I mean, it's, trying to rebuild a country halfway around the world is ridiculous. I'm not sure Iran or Pakistan or India or Russia is in any better position right now.
Well, just turning back to climate again, you have this good expression in the book called weirding, and there's no doubt that extreme weather events are on the increase. Now, confessional time, I have had a hardcore, what you would call climate deniers, or a climate denier as a guest on the show, because I wanted to hear what he had to say. I've even got friends who are like, oh, humans don't cause global warming, it's BS. And what I say is, of course, global warming and climate change are conflated now, aren't they? As well as that's quite deliberate, I'm sure. But I say, look, for me personally, I've got no idea what's going on. There's evidence on both sides, but the bottom line is that the climate is changing, if you see what I mean. So it's almost like a way to deal with objectors to some of your ideas. It's like, okay, well, whatever, it's changing. So, it could be caused by by the Martians. The point is it's happening.
Yeah. Well, I think I love the expression global or whatever, global weirding. It's another one I borrowed. I did not come up with that one. But I think the best explanation I had was I was lucky enough to have John Holdren, who's now is a professor back when I was an undergrad at Berkeley. He's now one of the science advisors for Barack Obama. So, he's certainly gone up in the world since he was teaching me. But he was talking about climate change back, and this would have been 1989, I believe. And his point even then was that the thing about climate change is that the extremes get more extreme. A lot of it has to do with just the physics of the evaporation of water. The more water you get in the atmosphere, the bigger the storms get. The water in clouds is normally below freezing anyway, so that can mean something like a giant snowstorm as easily as it can mean a giant rainstorm as long as the air is below freezing. But yeah, you get lots of energy getting trapped on Earth, and then that energy goes somewhere. It's going to heat something up. And usually that means water is going to evaporate off of something. So that means the deserts are going to get drier. That means there's going to be more droughts. But that also means there's going to be more water in the air, which means there's going to be bigger storms. And that's basically what we're seeing. The very simple discussion like that, you can follow along and see why, that's why I call it global weirding, is it's not just that everything gets a little hotter, it's that the extremes get more extreme.
I think you see this in articles and publications even, that the record freezing winters are there for refute the notion of global warming, which is why, of course, the climate change thing came along, because global warming was around for a long time, but then any time it was unseasonably cold, which was probably about half as often as it was unseasonably hot, people would wheel that out and say, you see, this is all nonsense. Yeah.
I think, do you know the cartoon XKCD by any chance?
No, I don't.
Oh, you should start reading it. He's very much a science geek, and he does these great cartoons. And one of the ones he did was dealing with that whole issue, and he just, in cartoon form, he showed that we still get severe winters, but actually we get far fewer severe winters than happened, say, 50 years ago, and they're not as cold. But the thing is, they look more severe because we're not used to them anymore.
Yeah, I'm old enough to remember here in Britain the 1976 summer, which I'm reliably informed was, I think that was the absolute scorching summer. And if it wasn't that year, there was another year in the 70s when it was a record cold winter. And the reason I mention this is because one thing I've noticed really is a blurring of the seasons. You can get, what would pass in Britain anyway for warm days in October or November. And I actually, a couple of years ago on my birthday, which is in August, there was some snow. Now, it was very, very little snow, but the point was I remember looking out the window and going, oh, shit, it's snowing in August.
It does happen. That's the thing is, big heavy storm can lumber in and cool the air down enough to drop some snow as opposed to rain. That's one reason I like that mosaic model so much, is you can apply it to the weather. Instead of, we'd like to talk about average temperatures, but if you think about it, the weather is basically kind of a mosaic. You get a cold front, you get a hot front, you get droughts, you get floods, you get, a stretch of warm weather, but it comes a piece at a time because these fronts are moving around the globe. And one of the things you see with climate change, you still get good weather, you still get bad weather, but some of the pieces drop out. You won't see as many blizzards, for instance, or maybe you see more, but you'll see some things will become less and less common and then they disappear, and some things become more and more common. I think for most of us in the temperate zone, one of the things we're going to have to worry about a lot more is hurricanes. You guys in Britain are going to probably start getting hit by a lot more cyclones than you have in the past.
Well, it's an amazing thing about the weather in Britain is it's incredibly stable compared to a lot of regions of the world. Now, I know that the US is so big, it's a continent in itself, really, if we're honest. It's not a country from from a climatic point of view. But, I've noticed the very marked uptick in extreme weather events that have been hitting the US. Hurricanes, cyclones. I don't necessarily understand the definitions, how they differ. But
well, to clarify that, cyclone, typhoon, hurricane, and what's the other one I'm missing? And they're all the same thing. It's just hurricanes when it comes out of hurricane is when it comes out of the Caribbean and hits U.S. or something like that. Or one of the local areas. Typhoons happen in the Western Pacific around Asia. Cyclones happen around Australia. I think in Britain you call them cyclones.
I've never experienced one, so.
Well, usually they're like tropical storms or tropical depressions by the time you get to you. But anyway, they're all the same storm. They're all called cyclonic storms. It's just people had their own names in the different oceans for these events, and now we're kind of stuck with them.
Okay, consider myself told. In 1987. There was a famous storm in the south of the UK that I don't think was even, a pinprick compared to some of the stuff that you see certainly in the US, but it made the news back then because of the devastation it caused. And that's the last time I could remember reading about, any sort of similar event in this country. So, but as you say, going forward, things may change. Certainly, as I say, the seasons are all messed up here. And one thing we have seen a huge increase in the UK is flooding.
Mm-hmm. I'm not surprised.
So now, you mentioned average temperatures there a moment ago. Let's talk a little bit about your chapter, Black Swans and Dragon Kings, because it kind of highlights popular misunderstandings about figures, because one thing that gets wheeled out a lot, whether it's climate change campaigners or whether it's, as I said, so-called climate deniers, is they bring numbers to bear to try and make a point. And it was a really eye-opening chapter, actually, because it underscores misunderstandings that I think most of us have.
The whole chapter is called Long Tails, Dragon Kings, and Black Swans. And the idea, I hate to do this to people because most people aren't terribly comfortable with visualizing graphs. But you have to think of one of those, sort of a starts from zero and goes off to whatever, infinity, some large number. And it starts very high at zero and then it curves down and has this long, long tail going out. It's a J-shaped graph, basically, if you sort of in half of a parabola, except that it extends out. And the thing is, that's a very common graph in nature. It's very common in business, too. I mean, if you know Amazon, Amazon's business model is basically selling that, what they call the long tail. It's all these things where there's very little business, but if you've got a big enough warehouse, you can afford to do it, and that's what Amazon does. In nature, you see those all over the place. You see them in the ecology because usually if you go in an oak wood, for instance, or an oak forest, there's usually like one or two dominant oak trees that are most of the forest. But there may be 100 other species of plants there. It's just that when you walk around, there's like one or two individuals of each of these plants per acre. There's some that are a little bit more common. There may be a field of what do you have there? Cowslips or violets or something like that. And then there's a few, like maybe some hazels that are a little bit more common than that. But that's the essence of the J. Now, when you're talking about a dragon king, the dragon king is that's another mathematical phenomenon. That's what's at the peak. So in the oak forest, the oaks are sort of the dragon kings. The example of the guys who invented the idea of the Dragon King used is the size of the city of Paris relative to the other cities in France. If in most countries there's this distribution, there's usually one or two really big cities. There's a few more medium-sized cities. There's lots of small cities. There's a lot of even more little tiny towns, and then there's little villages and scattered suburbs and whatever all over the place. It's a J-shaped curve. Paris is a little weird in the global sense because it is so much bigger than one would predict just by scaling up all the other cities of France and trying to draw a J-shaped curve, and that's what they mean by a dragon king. Now, Black Swan is something that's totally different, but it's probably a lot of these are also dragon kings. That's what's his name? Nassim Taleb. I'm horrible with people's names, so please forgive me if I get people's names wrong. His idea, the Black Swan, is an event that cannot be predicted in advance. It's an event that has a disproportionately huge impact on whatever you're looking at. And in retrospect, it can be explained. Now, Taleb was working in the stock market. He's an economist, anyway, he works with mathematics. So he's looking at things like stock market crashes, where it's really hard to predict the stock market when a market's going to crash, especially if it's going to do some sort of stupid flash crash. But afterwards, when people are picking up the pieces, you can look at it and go, oh yeah, that's why this crash happened. Well, maybe we should stop it from happening again. And inevitably, if they stop it, so the market crashes for some other reason. And his point about them being they're both Dragon Kings and Black Swans, is if you look at the American stock market, most of the variation in the stock market was accounted for by, I think, 5 crashes when he wrote that book. So if you just look at the normal market, it's just basically kind of bumbling along, increasing a little bit. It's just generally increasing a little bit. But then, in 1929 or 1986, it just kind of, the bottom drops out and it goes kaboom. And when he started looking, he started seeing black swans all over the place. The evolution of humans in the world. Who would have thought that a bipedal primate would turn out to be something, that's taking over the world? Well, nobody could have predicted that, but look at us now. The thing is, some things can be black swans, both black swans and dragon kings. The thing about the black swan is, as far as we're concerned going into it, it's random. You can't predict a black swan when a black swan's going to hit, or it's not a black swan. If it's predictable, it's not black. And if the event's huge enough, it's a dragon king. So, but I think the big point there is that is to think about the world is sort of uneven, and randomness or unpredictability having a huge impact.
Well, you ventured onto the territory of economics there, and that prompts my next question really, which is one of the huge issues really facing us is a result of the economic model that pretty much dominates globally, and that's one of endless growth. Whether it be in terms of, just resources or whether it's the banking sector, it's just that the only way is up, except when it's not, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I totally agree. We're blowing a bubble. I mean, yeah, that's the simplest way to understand it is if you've got if you've got bubble gum or just a, soap bubble, we're blowing a bubble, and, bubbles typically grow until they don't. And that's why I think a lot of people look at the end of the bubble and go, oh my God, we're all going to die. But, the thing is, if a system, something as complicated as our global economic system falls apart, it's probably going to fall apart in a very complicated way. I don't think we're going to wake up one morning and go, oh my God, we're all going to die. In my book, I assumed it was going to take something like 50 years for it to fall apart, but I honestly don't know. That's a black swan waiting to happen. We don't know how a global capitalist system falls apart. We haven't seen that happen yet.
Well, this is similar to, again, John Michael Greer's idea that rather than dropping off a cliff, that we'll see crises interspersed with periods of relative stability. And it's going to be like a flight of stairs down, if you see what I mean, as opposed to just sort of a jump off the cliff. Yeah,
I'll say straight up, I got that idea from him. John Michael Greer was very inspirational, and I tend to agree. Yeah, I mean, I think the only way at this point we could have a sudden collapse of global capitalism is basically nuclear war. And I honestly don't think I think that's very unlikely that we're ever going to go there.
One of the problems linked to the so-called, let's say, endless growth economic paradigm is that it's detached from what we actually have on the Earth in terms of resources, and I include in that energy as well. So it doesn't reflect that, and that's going to be something that's going to show up with increasing frequency, I think, because no amount of ones and noughts on a computer screen is going to make more water or make more food or make more oil. It doesn't compute on that level. Yeah,
but I do have to say that you have to be careful about being too simplistic. I'm not scolding you. I'm just saying this. For instance, with surface water, I think we currently use something like 2 or 3 times as much surface water as there is on the planet every year. I'll just give the gross example because it's a running joke in the Midwest, is the water that feeds the Mississippi River comes out of a spring in Minnesota. And other rivers, of course, drain into it. But by the time that water gets to the city of New Orleans, it's passed through at least 6 different sets of kidneys and gone back to the river.
God. Yeah, I've heard something similar before. It's horrific.
Yeah. And that's the thing about, the thing with, with fresh water, with groundwater, certainly, it's not being replaced nearly as fast as it's being used, and we're in serious trouble. With surface water, conceivably, and I will underline, italicize, boldface the conceivably, we could get away with recycling it if we were better at recycling it. Of course, most people, in California invented the term toilet to tap as a sort of this horror of don't recycle our water, but, come on. That's the thing about peak resources. If you're using up something that's truly limited, that's a problem. Groundwater, if you're tapping out groundwater 1,000 times faster than it's being replenished by rain percolating in, that's a problem. But if you're recycling surface water, it's hard to tell if that's a problem or not. If you get into a drought, that can be a problem really quickly, but, it's a very complicated situation.
Well, I read somewhere that recycled toilet water, for want of a better expression, was actually better quality, or was comparable quality, for example, to bottled water, in the sense that the process was so thorough, probably because it has to be. Mm-hmm. But it's more of a psychological thing, I think, trying to get over that for people. Yeah.
One experiment that failed, but I loved it. I went to the University of Wisconsin for grad school. The first year I was there, the local water agency was selling or giving away bottled water called Outhouse Springs. Why settle for number 2? And it was, it was basically reclaimed sewage water, basically. And I had it, and it was perfectly, it was tap water. They didn't catch on. I mean, even trying to market ironically, people were a little too grossed out. But we don't have trouble cleaning water. That's not the problem. The problem is trying to get people to realize that, if you really want 10 billion people to live on this planet in perpetuity, you've got to recycle everything, and that's kind of gross. And you can't be stupid about it.
That psychological issue makes me think of what a lot of people engaged in this debate are struggling with, and that's that so many of the issues we are talking about have got a social and a political dimension, and it's not really a simple case of, as you point out in the book, oh, well, scientists say they could do this, they can fix that. But a lot of the reasons why things happen and why they don't happen are to do with social and political reasons. And those, particularly political, can be very difficult to overcome.
The book is basically 42 essays for those who haven't read it yet. And one of the essays is called The Difficult Problems, and that came from my experience as an environmentalist, because I come from a family of engineers, and I went and got technical degrees or scientific degrees. So to me, the hard problems were always science, and and I could never understand why the administrators had so much trouble doing anything when the answer was, to me, obvious. And working as an environmentalist and watching what happens with city councils or county board of supervisors or politics of any sort, it's become blindingly obvious that actually the technical solutions are the easy part. The political and social changes are by far the most difficult problems. And I wrote that chapter in the book specifically to try and help people with my background, because I suspect they're going to be reading the book, to understand why it's not a technical fix. Primary problem is that we have to transform civilization in ways that most people really don't want to be transformed right now.
Yeah, that's the nub of it there, isn't it, really? That people don't want to face change. They certainly don't want to do less. And politicians, and so therefore they're not going to vote for any politician who suggests any of the above. And politicians understand this, so therefore they basically tell people what they want to hear. And I think you can see that now very much in the early days of the US presidential run. Donald Trump is absolutely playing to the gallery.
Yeah, he is. And the thing is, I have to slightly disagree, because I keep thinking, when I hear that, I think about Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Churchill whipping up people to suffer and sacrifice during World War II, and that worked. I think it can be politically possible if you have the right people in the right conditions. As you said, every time someone talks about climate change, if there's kids around, you usually find the parents looking at the kids and looking very worried or very sad. That's one of the things. If you ask most parents, will they sacrifice for the good of their kids? I think most parents will. The bigger problem is the social problems are a lot of things like recycling or just environmental problems in general. They're very vulnerable to problems that I would call stupidity and evil. I have more environmental problems with people stepping in the wrong place and killing some little endangered plant than I do with people, getting someone to set up a preserve around the plant. And of course, evil. There's people that will just want their way regardless. Those are much more difficult problems to root out. And if we have to have a system where everybody has to be good and has to be smart and has to be that way all the time, and we can't suffer idiots, that's hard.
Yeah, I go along with your objection there. I just think maybe that the world has changed, and I'm not trying to buy into some, post-millennial sort of cynicism here, but I see a difference between my generation, the generation here, the age that my kids would be, or previous generation, my parents, my grandparents, and it's not just the people, but it's just everything around them has changed. And I'm not sure that the culture of sacrifice that you mentioned, perhaps around the Second World War, would, and again, feel free to disagree, I'm not sure that would really wash today, not on the same scale.
Well, you're almost certainly right in the short run. In the long run, if everything starts falling apart, yeah, we're going to be sacrificing. We're going to be downsizing. I mean, that's always the hard part about are you willing to take preventative action you're willing to sacrifice today to have a better life tomorrow? And most people find that very difficult. And, I certainly find it difficult, so I don't blame anybody. But it is very hard to sacrifice right now. But I think saying, therefore, it's hard for all humans to sacrifice, period, that's not so true. But it does make it very hard right now to get people to start doing the right thing.
Well, yeah, it's, as you say, change is coming. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, it's happening now. The question is, do we move with it and change now, or do we wait for the future when our opportunities will be perhaps constricted, when it won't be so comfortable? And I think, was it The Limits to Growth? Was it 1972 that was published?
Something like that.
Yeah, and that's like...
I don't remember exactly, but I think you're about right.
It's kind of scarily relevant, really. And it's kind of like all that time, I was 3 in 1972. And far from learning any of the lessons and there was other publications like that came out at the time, it's just been an acceleration towards all the sorts of disastrous policies and modes of thinking that we've been talking about.
It has. It's sort of like predicting a market crash. I remember back in 2001 and 2002, I was this, struggling, broke grad student. And to me, it was obvious that the U.S. was setting up for this monster market bubble in the real estate market. And it became even more obvious to me as the succeeding years went on. And it was obvious to a lot of the people I was talking to. And then we get to, and I kept praying, not quite literally praying that the bubble would pop like in 2004 so that people wouldn't be hurt too badly. And, finally it ground on and ground on and ground on. And then finally in 2008, government's going, oh my God, we've got a bubble. And I'm looking at that and thinking, yeah, did you really delude yourself that long? Well, and that's the problem we've got with limits of growth is, they made some solid predictions. Those predictions didn't turn out to be numeric, they didn't turn out to be exactly right, and people disregarded them. And so, they're probably still ballpark correct that what we've got going on right now is unsustainable. But one of the things I really don't deal with in the book, and this is why, is right now it's impossible to say when are things going to start really breaking down. They could have started breaking down already in 2001 with the invasion of Iraq. They could start breaking down in 2035 if we just keep on burning fossil fuels, and that's when we hit the 2-degree mark, and that's when the crack should really start showing. They could happen in 2050. They could possibly, conceivably happen in 2100 if we really try working at sustainability and fail. We don't know what the future is. I've actually had some feedback from readers who wanted me to talk about what I thought was going to happen in coming decades, and my response is the same one I wrote in the book, is if I knew what was going to happen in coming decades, I'd be getting rich helping people prepare. I have no clue.
Okay, let's talk about population, or rather depopulation, because in your book you've got some stark thoughts, predictions, however you want to put it, about the future of the human population on Earth. And I mean, literally as low as 500 million at some point, I believe. Now, you contrast that with how many people are living in the US at the minute. Is it around about 300,000, I think? Sorry, 300 million?
It's around about 300 million.
Yeah. Now, this show should be airing across the EcoShock network in the US, and a recent guest on there, Stuart Scott, he made a prediction that going forward with the sort of crises that we're talking about, that maybe half the world population could die off. But that looks extremely conservative contrasted against your predictions.
I don't know what Stuart Scott said, but his prediction could be the same as mine depending on the time frame. If he's talking about half the people dying in, say, the 21st century, we might be in agreement, or by 2050. Yeah, I think the thing about population, that was the hardest chapter for me to write, I think, emotionally. And because the thing is, I don't particularly like contemplating the idea of people, well, basically, I don't have any children, but my nieces and nephews, as they get older, dying and not having any kids of their own. It's a horrible thought, but you have to, it's one of the things. If you're going to write about the crash of civilization, you have to deal with it. It's not, you don't get a situation where civilization crashes and 10 million people or 10 billion people get along just fine without it. But I'll be honest, I don't know what the number, how low population would go. I think it's sort of what's important to me is the idea that some people survive. And it gets back to that whole thing about apocalypse or sort of a transhuman singularity, everybody's fine, is if you say everybody's going to go extinct or there's only going to be 100 survivors or 1,000 survivors, that's not that different, and most people are smart enough to realize that's not that different than saying you're all going to die. Your chance of being that 1 in a million person who survives is very low. And I did have a bit of an agenda in this book, and part of it was to get people to start thinking about preparing. And you have to, to prepare, you have to have hope. So that's part of what drives the numbers. I don't know. I'll say right up, I don't know how low populations could go. I made some guesses in the book. In the hundreds of millions, it could go a lot lower. Possibly it could stay a little higher. I don't know.
Well, of course, there was a time in the past when the world population was much, much lower than it is now. In fact, you pointed out there was possibly relating to that massive supervolcano that erupted over India at some point in the distant past, that numbers could be scarily low. But we've had successful global civilizations with a fraction of the people that are around now. But because, again, we're thinking on our time scale in decades, because of the length of our own lives, that basically the population has been forever increasing and that's the only way it can go. But take, for example, what happened with the Black Death in Europe. You know, population absolutely decimated. Of course, it recovered, if you want to use that term. But I guess what I'm saying is that going through the process of population reducing, depending on what shape that takes, might not be a very comfortable process. But I think what I'm doing here is just bearing out your point that the collapse of global civilization, a massively reduced population, is not the end of civilization. An expression I've used before is that even in the Dark Ages, people loved and, created art and just all these other things that make the human experience as rich as it is, even in the teeth of that terrible time.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people forget, or don't actually, I don't think they forget, they don't know. During the height of the Little Ice Age, which I believe was the 16th century, the estimates from the demographers are a third of the people on the planet died. And that was, that's between the Renaissance and the Enlightenment in Europe. But, that's also between the Ming Dynasty and the Qing Dynasty in India, not in India, in China. The Mughal dynasty in India was, I think, either collapsed or had a civil war. The Ottomans had a civil war. Kingdoms in Africa collapsed. There were wars all through the Americas and the colonies. And that was just a degree drop in average temperature on the globe across a century. But the thing is, by the Enlightenment, the population rebounded fairly quickly. I think the thing to realize when our numbers right now are boosted up by things like artificial nitrogen fixation, and if we lose that, the ability to fix nitrogen on the truly colossal scale we're doing it now, I don't think we can get to 10 billion. I think we'd struggle to support even a billion, and of course the numbers could be much lower than that. So it's both ecological and political and historical even. Populations have dipped. We just tend to gloss over that part of the record.
When people who are saying that basically we can combat this situation that we're facing, technology will provide a solution in terms of energy, and let's face it, without energy, we have nothing. Renewables, solar, wind, tidal, all the rest of it, and nuclear are held up as kind of like these are the, poster children. In one of these, if not both, lies our energy future. But I've had guests on who dispute both of those, and to be honest with you, looking at the numbers, which a lot of people don't realistically look at, I don't think we can power the society that we've got now with renewables, and I think nuclear is so dangerous and so expensive, and bear in mind we still haven't found a way to safely dispose of nuclear waste. We're just piling it up. We haven't actually managed to process it. Then I think there are many risks there too.
Yeah. I think the caveat there is that we can't take a civilization that's fueled by fossil fuels, pull off the gasoline engine and the gas tank, plug in a solar panel with a battery and expect it to work the same way. I mean, that just doesn't work. So I would say it is possible that, and I'll just offer a beacon of hope. It is possible, if we want to totally transform civilization, that we might be able to support multiple billions of people running on wind and solar. There's no particular reason to think that's impossible, but the thing is that's a transformation that's sort of on the scale of what we went through between, say, 1900 and 1950 when we went onto oil. So it may be doable, it may not be doable, but people have to realize that, everything from the shape of cities to, the shape of houses, how the roofs are aligned to catch the sun, and where where wind farms can be located, and how we get to work and where we work and what the roads are built of and how we distribute our food and how we process our water and all that. all that has to change if we're going to try and be sustainable. Now, you can either look at that as, oh my God, that's too big, we can't possibly do that, or you can look at that as and say, well, some people are probably going to become billionaires figuring out these solutions, which is sort of what Elon Musk is doing right now with his batteries. And I think I'm a little disgusted right now that so many capitalists are kind of pushing their line of we can't possibly do that, as opposed to looking that this is this massive opportunity to rebuild civilization, be the heroes, and make a lot of money doing it. So I guess that would be my hopeful message instead of my doomy gloomy message. I tend to, in this book, I say explicitly right up front and at the end, this is my pessimistic view. So the nice thing about being a pessimist is I'm either going to be right about it, or I'll be very happily disappointed that things turned out so much better than I predicted. So either way, I get something out of it.
I liked your little section in the book where you were talking about the quality of concrete. As someone who's very interested in architecture, this caught my imagination, because I've said many times that with few exceptions, we're not building for the future. It's almost like at the darkest corners of our psyche, collectively speaking, that we almost realize that the game's almost up. So why build a building that's going to last for 1,000 years? And that's how I see it anyway. And I work in the cathedral here locally, and they have a museum which includes some Roman walls. And almost every day I marvel at these things, and I've also had foreign visitors in there, especially Americans actually, because anything over a couple of hundred years seems impossibly old to some of the Americans. And it's like this thing has been here for 2,000 years, and look at what's happened to it in the meantime, and it's still standing.
Absolutely, and I think I would be slightly more charitable about the concrete. And first, as one aside, there's this wonderful book, and I've forgotten the author. The book is called Concrete Planet. It's referenced in my book, and he talks about the history of concrete, and it's absolutely a joy to read. So you might appreciate that, and that's where I got a lot of my information about concrete. But I think to be slightly more charitable, if you believe in progress and growth and change, you don't build forever, because you assume that whatever you're doing is going to become outdated. So you want to leave it so that your kids can tear it down and build something better in its place. And I think that ideology is really embedded in the way we use reinforced concrete. As opposed to, say, and the other thing is with the Romans, and this is something I learned in that book. By the time the Pantheon in Rome is built out of concrete, and it's been standing for 1,800 some odd years now, and it's possible to build for the ages with concrete as long as it's not reinforced with iron bars. The thing is that by the time the Romans got around to building the Pantheon, they'd been building with concrete for centuries, and we've been building it with it for something like 120 years. So we're only now learning all the problems with it that the Romans had figured out before they started building big buildings with it.
Okay, let's take a leap. Another chapter in your book, which resonates strongly with some of my thinking, is talking about electronics and data, and going forward into the future, what survives and what doesn't. Because I sent you a link to
that YouTube. Yeah, I saw the YouTube video.
Yeah, exactly. And I know you were like taking issue with a couple of aspects of it, but I thought that was just like, yeah, of course, in the future, who's to say what an individual or a population would understand? Who's to say they'll even speak the same language? You've got an interesting chapter on that. Who will understand how to use these devices? If someone 200 years from now finds a CD, are they even going to know what it is?
Well, I think my answer, and this is from hanging out with engineers, is that most of our computers right now are designed to last maybe a decade. So, and I think CDs last, if we're lucky, 20 years. So if we're depending on those for getting our records to the future, I don't think it's going to work very well.
Yeah, exactly. And that raises all sorts of questions about so much of what we carry from one generation to another in terms of culture. I mentioned language, if you see what I mean. It's like civilization, society could radically change if the past is somehow erased or it fades from memory, if you see what I mean.
Oh yeah, absolutely. This is a big theme in the book. The idea of the idea we're talking about with electronics is called the digital dark age, and so that's something people can look up if they want to find out about it. And it's been known as a problem since probably the early 1990s, I think, and that's when NASA realized that they hadn't really bothered to spend much energy saving all the data from the Apollo moon landings, and that the tapes were starting to fall apart. We don't know if we have any recording of any primary recording of Neil Armstrong setting foot on the moon, because apparently those tapes were reused maybe at some other point, or they were thrown out or something. We don't, so we're losing all our history. And the only way is if we have a digital history, the only way we save it is if it gets transferred fairly regularly, meaning every few years, into new media. So as you say, you back up your hard drive crashes, you transfer it on a new computer, you back it up again, and so forth. And every once in a while you update the formats. And if you do it in a CD, every once in a while you have to read the CD off and get it put into some other medium. And it's very much a process. And we're kind of lazy because we look at, we're used to seeing history on baked clay tablets, but the thing is we don't write our history on clay tablets anymore. So we kind of forget that our history right now is very, the word I love is evanescent, but, it's very fragile. If civilization crashes and we've become totally digital in a desperate attempt to save resources and save, keep trees in the ground instead of making paper out of them, what people will see out of us is a few big inscriptions on rocks, huge piles of rubble where they're shifting through the rubble to get the iron rebar out to reprocess it, and all these weird electronics that are falling apart and are basically junk. I mean, they're impure silicon and a few rare earths and some rust, basically, and that's going to be our legacy. And it's something I brought up in the book to think about is if we actually want to think about what's good, what good have we done, or that we should tell the future about, or conversely, what did we do with climate change that we should warn the future about? We don't really know how to send those records forward, and nobody's really working on it. Or actually, I shouldn't say that. Very few people are working on it.
Yeah, it's another point you make in the book. Really, is it's quite thought-provoking. Is we've never been more sort of omnipresent across the Earth as a species, but there might be a time when, compared to other ages, that relatively little is remembered of our time here.
Yeah, I think that's inevitable. And what brought that home to me was something I read after I finished the book. It was a little article about, you may have seen it, where some archaeologists found remnants of cultivated barley and I think einkorn wheat and some common weeds in a little camp. It's under the Sea of Galilee now, but it would have been on the shores of Galilee, and it was evidence of agriculture, but it was 23,000 years old. Now, if you know the history, we think agriculture was invented 10,000 years ago, and what happened most likely was that the climate change, and during an ice age, the climate's very unstable. That's when that's why I'm saying in the past everything's migrated, because that's how you deal with ice ages. Climate's very unstable, swings back and forth many degrees fairly quickly, and animals and plants migrate. But what happened most likely is people invented agriculture, say 23,000 years ago. They had to give it up because the climate changed. They can no longer grow their wheat in around the Sea of Galilee. And then 10,000 years ago, they invented it again. And we've lost that history of 23,000 years ago. I mean, if it wasn't for this accidental site, we wouldn't even know that agriculture was invented. Someone had been playing around with agriculture so very early on in human history. Human history is 100,000 years. We know a fair amount about the last 7,000 years, in pieces. We know a lot less about the last 10,000 years before that, and then it gets progressively more fragmentary before that. And I think, if we're talking about humans going into the deep future, where we have a future history of hundreds of thousands or millions of years, there's going to be a point when, basically everything we've done is forgotten. The only remnant of our civilization is going to be the carbon left in the atmosphere.
Well, it makes you wonder about the psychology of our legislators and politicians, or even, to be honest with you, scientists, all sorts of categories of people. are not communicating what they know to the public about this. And there are people who know and get what we're talking about, and they're not telling the public, and they're doing nothing to abate any of this. And I don't know what the mindset is there, except that what, again, to refer to JMG, what he says, well, I'll be dead then.
I would actually disagree with you on that. For instance, this book, the book I wrote, was done entirely off of books that I was getting out of the library, papers I was getting off the internet, and to a lesser extent, books I was buying. There's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of political information out there. I've met with the people that are working, when I put my environmentalist hat on, I've met with the people who are working on climate change for California. What's not happening is this is not part of our everyday conversation. And, the thing is, that's one of the things about writing about books about the deep future. I mean, there's a great book by Kurt Stager, and I hope I pronounced his name right, called Deep Future, that really inspired me to write this book, because when I first started thinking about it, I saw, ooh, deep future, this book will answer my questions. And then I read his book, and it's a very good book. I strongly recommend it. But basically, he wrote about the first half of what I wrote. And, so he's, the information's out there. He was writing about climate change and mass extinction and possible, he didn't really want to go into the collapse of civilization, but he was talking about all the environmental factors. And other people have done it. David Archer's done it. Al Gore's done it, sort of, at least for up to 2050. But these books are just sitting on the library shelves. They're not selling very well. They're not being bestsellers. They're not becoming something where you can you can sit there at a bar and argue about the best way to make sustainable beer. And I think that's too bad.
Okay, well, perhaps we don't necessarily disagree. I should refine my former statement by saying that, it's not part of the popular conversation. If you look at the media, this sort of coverage is scarce. So a casual observer looking on, there appears to be very little about these topics coming out, though it's all there under the surface. Yeah,
and I strongly encourage everybody listening to this, go out and look in your libraries. The information's out there. It's not, most of the people, there isn't a conspiracy to try and hide it. And I'm certainly not part of any conspiracy to try and hide this information. I think most of us would be a lot happier if we had more people to talk to rather than fewer.
In terms of thinking earlier what we were saying about scientists, there is this idea about what's physically possible, again, that you mentioned in the book about that, therefore it will get done. But the political and social aspects that I also mentioned earlier get in the way of this. And we see this perhaps with, you mentioned transhumanism and the singularity, this idea that, it's blue sky thinking that we're going to sail off into a technological sunset. And I think that is the opposite face of the outright doom scenario. We're all going to die, but equally unlikely. And no matter what scientists say, we can do this, we can build this, this is doable, here are the blueprints. That doesn't mean it's going to happen. And of course, there are some technological, if not fixes, there are some technological solutions that could help us in this area. But quite often they're not implemented, and it seems to me partly because by doing so somehow acknowledges that we've got a problem.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think great point brought up by there's this blog called On the Record. It's a California water blog. It's done by this anonymous bureaucrat, and she deals with that because she's sitting in these meetings and watching the politicians do this all the time. And there's this enormous desire for win-win solutions. And for instance, in California, I think we've suffered from a serious drought, and 80% of our water goes to agriculture, and a large part of that goes to things like almond orchards that are owned by huge companies or billionaires, and they're exporting the almonds to China, which is all very good, except that you're taking water out of a desert during a drought and exporting it to a country that's got a lot of water, which doesn't help the other people that need the water. But the politicians are not willing to deal with that because they would be forcing these very rich people to lose, and that would probably end up in a lawsuit, and things would get ugly, and we can't have that. so there's no solution. And then they'll put it off in a study, and then a few years later they'll come up with the same problem again.
Well, I've read a lot about the situation in California regarding drought. I've looked at the map that you can find online of the US that shows various degrees of water stress across the nation, state by state. And I find it difficult to tell what's really happening because, I've read articles that are saying, Las Vegas is under huge water stress and it's going to become absolutely unsustainable within however many years, not very many. And yeah. I've read all sorts of horror stories about LA and other areas in California. And again, it's difficult to make sense of because you get conflicting messages coming out. I mean, certainly if you land in LA or Las Vegas today, it looks pretty much business as usual. So to what extent, it's very difficult to get an accurate picture. It's certainly looking at the mainstream media anyway. Yeah,
and I think, to be fair, it's complicated. And I think water politics is always complicated. So, and I think, I'm sure if you try to look at British water politics, you'd find it's probably more complicated than you think it is too. But yeah, the problem with California is we don't know how much groundwater we've got, and we've been pulling water out of the ground to make up for shortfalls on surface water. So that gives this great, and then we have to keep putting in new houses and developing more businesses and so forth and so on because we want to look like we're prosperous so we don't have everybody running away screaming. And when you get that situation, it's impossible to tell exactly what's happening. In fact, I don't think the water people necessarily know what's happening because we don't know what's going on with the groundwater. At least in the Central Valley and probably a lot of other places.
I recently read an article talking about Mexico, and I can't remember if it was Mexico City or Rio, but I'm sure it was one of the two. That it might have been Sao Paulo actually. Anyway, point is, they'd gone down to something like 2 or 3 days a week of actually allowing residents to draw running water because their water crisis is so severe. It was literally like, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you can have water. The rest of the time, tough luck.
Yeah, that's a problem all through the world. If you want to see a bad problem, I think you can ask the Iraqis how much water they have. But there's the slums throughout the world. I mean, they buy water by the bottle. They don't even have tap water. Water's a huge issue. Last year I had some guests from Switzerland staying for a couple of weeks, and they thought, this was in the middle of the drought, and it was ironic because they thought we thought we were being fairly conservative, but they looked at us and said we were being insanely wasteful just in our house. And it's, I don't know how you get through that. I mean, I'm as wasteful as anybody else, I'm afraid. And that's one thing I should say is I'm very much a normal person in this one. Being able to see a problem and talk about it is a first step. It doesn't necessarily mean you can solve it. I certainly live unsustainably, and so does my family. And it would be very hard for me to get to a sustainable lifestyle, even if I wanted to. And I do want to, but it turns out it's very, very hard.
I stayed for a few weeks on a farm in Australia, and that was an object lesson in being careful with your water because there was no mains water. This was like miles away from anywhere. And they had a water tank outside that collected rainwater. When you flushed the toilet, it used the water that you'd used from washing up the dishes. And it really was like brought home to me. If you're going to do anything with water in this house, think about it. Even the water in the shower was recycled.
Yeah, it's totally important. But for instance, where my wife works, they expect her to be, showered and shined up every morning, drought or no drought. So, we have showers every day. I can't take a shower once a month here. That would leave her unemployed. I mean, it literally is little things like that.
Yeah, it's still a collective denial, isn't it? Really, that this sort of, as I mentioned earlier, elephant in the room, but nobody's willing to call a spade a spade. If that's not mixing up the metaphors too much.
Yeah, I agree. Denial is a big part of the problem, and getting people. That gets back to that whole chapter of the difficult problems. People don't want. People want to think that they're living the good and proper life that they're supposed to be living, and telling them that they're not is a very hard message.
I honestly don't know what I would do if I had kids. I think I would say to them, I'd be completely honest about it. and just say this is the way it is, and learn to do something practical with your hands. Learn to make something or repair something, and don't throw your lot in with industries that are going to go away in your lifetime, probably. So, but it's a difficult one.
Yeah, it is. And I think, because I'm looking at my nieces and nephews who are going, and some of them whom are out of college and some of whom are fairly young. And, on the one hand, it's hard to get even get a stable career now, at least in Southern California. But on the other, you've got to tell these kids who've grown up with the internet that they've got to learn to adapt. And that's the message. They have that's something they never learned as kids, or for them, at least for the older ones. It's going to be hard. But I think the bigger message that I really hope gets out, at least from this book, is that when we're talking about climate change, we're not talking about something that's over and done in 10 years. It's not if you survive the crash, then you get to go on to build a new, a nice new civilization in the sun. These problems roll out for, even if we magically stopped polluting, stopped dumping carbon in the atmosphere today, it would take 200 years for the things to chill back out to about 20th century normal. And if we burn all our fossil fuels, we're probably looking at something like 400,000 years before it goes back to normal. And these are not, when you're preparing for that kind of future, you have to realize it's going to change. Things are going to keep changing throughout your lifespan, no matter what happens. That's what people have to be prepared for. It's not we switch to a new grim reality. It's you switch to a grim reality, then it gets better, then it's grimmer, then it's better, then maybe it's really grim. So that descending staircase that John Michael Greer was talking about, and he may or may not have the right model, but I think everybody who's thought about it and looked at it and talks about it says this is a very long-term process. Things are going to change, they're going to keep changing, and that's what we have to adapt to.
One aspect of your book, which is absolutely fascinating, is looking forward into the far future of evolution on planet Earth, specifically human evolution, but other things as well. And it's one of the things that sets your book apart from any other book that I've read on climate change. So just tell us a little bit about that. Okay,
well, I think on the most basic level, I think humans, my feeling is that humans probably won't evolve into some alien species or whatever new species anytime soon. But I think, and I'll get back to why I believe that, but I think the bigger message in the book, and it's funny because a number of people have read it, said the book is actually very hopeful. And I want to stress the message I feel, and this is my belief, is that humans are not going to go extinct for a long time into the future. We will suffer a lot. We will go, this is going to be a huge, we'll probably have a huge crash of civilization. That probably won't be the first crash of civilization. And if we live through it, it almost certainly won't be the last crash. But I think people will live in the future, and I think this is, if you like science fiction or fantasy, I would invite anybody who wants to start thinking about the deep future as a place to explore, at least in your imagination. But the reason, getting to evolution, the simple answer is to first off on humans, we really have two inheritance systems. We have our genetic inheritance system, and then we inherit a lot through culture. And culture changes really, 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 really fast as an evolutionary tool. Think about how the internet's permeated our lives in the last 20 years or so. Who would have thought? And the thing is, because culture changes so fast, it protects our genes from facing evolution so much. Our genes do evolve. We're a lot more lactose tolerant than we used to be. We're a lot more immune to pandemics and some pandemic diseases than we used to be. But we're not radically changing physically so much as we're radically changing culturally when we deal with these climate adaptations, and that's the thing to remember. And I think, and the other thing to think about is going into the long term. So we'll probably cultures will keep changing, depending on, they have to fit into whatever the environment and other people throw at them, and for however many hundreds of thousands or millions of years our species survives. As far as a mass extinction goes, if you look at the fossil record, after previous big mass extinctions, it's taken 10 to 20 million years for the previous level of biodiversity to come back. So my book covers in very broad outline, the next 400,000 years. At least that's the last that's like the last third of the book, roughly. And it's very, obviously very general. But you have to realize 400,000 years is only 4% of 10 million years. So even after that time, Earth will not have fully recovered the biodiversity that we have now. That process takes a fairly long time. And the thing to remember is by the time, if our species manages to survive 10 million years, everything that exists then will have spent 10 million years evolving with humans. So it's going to be a very strange and possibly unnerving world from the way we look at it. It'll be when I say evolving with humans, that's things like domestic species, that's things like parasites, that's things like predators, and that's things like weeds that are absolutely and totally useless that have spent a long time evolving to be totally useless in every possible way to humans. And this is the future we're going to have to deal with. Pretty much regardless. We're a huge evolutionary force, and things are responding even now. So that's the discussion for evolution.
To finish on a positive note, one thing, I want to know what gives you cause for optimism. And you said the book is very pessimistic, but not 100% so. And for me, I see a lot of rise in localization, local currencies, organizations contracting from being global into state or citywide, increasing interest in organic food. Maybe that's not maybe economically, who can say if that makes sense, but it's certainly, sustainable, unlike the current model that we have for, food production and what have you. And, going forward, what gives you cause for optimism? Despite everything we're facing, and as you say, change is inevitable, but we can make the best of the situation if we choose to.
I would just say in the most abstract terms, there's a lot of nonlinear trends out there. The adoption of solar power and wind power is growing exponentially. The amount of coal use, at least in the U.S. and I believe Britain, is dropping exponentially. I think the Chinese are probably trying to wean themselves off coal, and it looks like India is the only country that's seriously thinking about using coal in the long term. The oil market's so chaotic right now that apparently some investors are starting to get out of it just because they can't guarantee that they're going to make any money when the oil prices are going berserk, and I mean down as well as up. So the next few years, I don't know. It's quite possible that we will see some radical transformation. We will see, hopefully, some localization, which is where we stop transporting food around the world and start growing it locally, because there's a tremendous amount of innovation going on in that sector right now, and it's really cool. So I would say the next decade really does matter. And hopefully I've told people that I really hope that in a decade I can write a book called Pleasantly Disappointed, where I say Hot Earth Dreams was totally wrong, and here's why. That would be wonderful. But I will say Hot Earth Dreams, I assume that we get partial control of our carbon emissions, but we don't get total control. So we actually, we get to using a lot less gas and oil and coal, but we never entirely wean ourselves off of it, so we actually crash in 100 years. So it's kind of a grim message, but I really honestly hope that Hot Earth Dreams turns out to have been unnecessarily alarmist. And I would say right now it's not impossible that will turn out to be the case.
Okay, Frank. Well, as you mentioned, Hot Earth Dreams, your book we've been discussing today. Tell folks about your web presence. I mean, the book is available widely on Amazon, for example, maybe elsewhere. And it seems you've self-published. And so second question really is, what feedback have you had from readers and also any other potential publishers for this? Because as I say, it's a hot potato.
It is. I did self-publish, and there are a lot of reasons for that. I had some advice from an agent I was talking to. I also looked at the way the previous books on the topic had performed in the market, and also how the authors had marketed themselves, and I didn't fit any of those profiles. So I just said, well, I might as well self-publish and see what happens. It has been selling. I wish it was a bestseller. It's not yet. You can see the status on Amazon if you look. What I want to see is I basically put it out there to see whether it would sell, because to see whether it would sell, and also to see whether I got anything so totally wrong that I needed to rewrite the book. And so far, nobody's pointed out anything that I got massively wrong. I mean, there's certainly a few small errors and a bunch of typos, but those can be fixed. As far as publishing it, I think what I'm going to, my optimal case right now is I'm going to wait till at least April before I start talking to publishers. And part of that is I want to see what happens with the results of the Paris climate talks back in, November. Because the thing is, if people start getting serious about taking on climate change and switching to renewable energies and all that, I'm honestly not one to sit there and say, you're all wrong, we're all going to die, it's all doom and gloom, it's not going to be that, come on. People do that anyway. I don't want to be one of the naysayers. I'd rather not live that reality. However, if by next Earth Day, people are still, we're seeing new gas and new oil and new coal, and, people are going, maybe the COP21 talks, we'll do that next year. At that point, I'm going to be talking to publishers, and, because I think the book will be even more relevant. So that's the long term. My web presence, there's a weird word. It's heteromeles, Heteromeles. That's usually my online name. I blog at heteromeles.wordpress.com. Heteromeles is the genus of my favorite shrub. It's a local thing called toyon. It grows in California, and I just picked it as my web name a very long time ago, and it's just kind of become my default online identity. And if you go to Heteromeles, you can read the first 5 chapters of the book. You can see comments on the book. You can find out where to buy it. You can certainly leave me comments. I very much appreciate it. You can see what else I'm doing. So,
wonderful. Well, Frank, thank you so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It was certainly a pleasure talking with you. And you had some great questions that made me think a lot. So thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, check out the website, which is legalizefreedom.com. That's legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programs offering alternative views on a wide range of topics, including politics and economics, energy and environment, culture, spirituality, history, and the nature of reality. You can also browse and buy a range of publications from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Whether you listen, donate, or do both, I greatly appreciate your support. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalizefreedom.com.